Can you imagine an act of pure kindness changing a family's destiny forever? On an isolated ranch, a widow and her children, marked by poverty, find a wounded rich cowboy near death. They save him without even dreaming that this simple gesture would unleash a web of secrets, dangers, and an inheritance that would transform their lives in unimaginable ways. Get ready for a story where compassion defies fate. The relentless desert sun relentlessly beat down on the small Miller ranch, nestled in the heart of a vast, arid expanse where life seemed to cling on by a thread. It was a place where shadows stretched long, and each sunrise brought with it the promise of yet another day of struggle, which once had sparkled with the vitality of youth and the joy of a simple life. She worked tirelessly to keep the ranch productive, to wring something from the land that could sustain her family, to keep John's memory alive through sheer toil. A horse, unsaddled and with tangled harness, galloped wildly towards them, seemingly in a panic, its eyes wide with terror, a chaotic image amidst the apparent calm. It wasn't long before, a few yards beyond the fence, they spotted a human figure lying motionless on the ground, like a discarded rag doll. Sarah's heart clenched in a knot of apprehension, a dark premonition. It was a tall, burly man, dressed in fine, though dirty and torn, cowboy clothes, with a crumpled hat discarded beside him. He was unconscious, and to Sarah's horror, a dark, spreading stain of blood soaked his clothes, staining the fabric. Tom, despite his young age and the shock of the scene, ran to check on the stranger, his courage overcoming his fear. "Mom, he's badly hurt. We have to help him," the boy cried, his voice choked with fear and the urgency the situation demanded. But the unrelenting drought, which stretched for seasons on end, combined with the accumulated debts that piled up like insurmountable mountains. Helping would mean another burden in their already overwhelmed lives, another mouth to feed, more risks in an existence already full of them. A rational mind screamed for prudence, for selfishness, for self-preservation. But her deeply ingrained morality and the vivid memory of John, her late husband, who had always been the first to lend a hand to those in need, without counting the cost, spoke louder, suppressing any hesitation. "Let's take him home, Tom. Carefully. Lily, bring water and clean cloths," she ordered, with a newfound determination that disguised the fear clutching her chest, her voice carrying an urgency that left no room for discussion. They barely knew that this act of kindness, seemingly insignificant, driven by compassion in the midst of their own misery, was the starting point of a journey that would forever transform poverty into an adventure full of unexpected twists, imminent dangers, and the discovery of an ancient secret that would change their lives in ways they could never have imagined. That man, a complete stranger on the brink of death, was the key to a future that, until then, existed only in Lily's most distant and utopian dreams. And the central conflict of their lives, the struggle for survival and the inherent goodness of the Miller family, had just gained a new, complex, and unexpected chapter. Fate had cast its dice, and the Miller family was about to discover what the future held for them. Seemed like a final sentence, a cruel verdict of fate that pushed her ever closer to the edge of the precipice. Despair threatened to settle in with each new dawn, a whispering voice trying to undermine her resolve. The fine dust, stirred by the ceaseless wind, coated every visible surface, from the fogged windows to the faded fences who found refuge and solace in drawing. The arid landscape on crumpled pieces of paper, guarded like precious treasures. She filled the gaps in harsh reality with the vibrant colors of her imagination, transforming desolation into something beautiful in her mind. Tom, on the other hand, older and burdened with a premature sense of responsibility that made him carry a heavy load on his shoulders, displayed an unusual maturity for his age. He helped his mother with the few scrawny head of cattle that still grazed with difficulty, and with the precarious maintenance of the fence, which threatened to collapse at any moment, a metaphor for their own lives. Both siblings, despite their young age, felt the weight of the situation, the hunger that gnawed at their stomachs with painful regularity, and the agonizing uncertainty of tomorrow, which stretched like a dense fog. Food was scarce, each meal carefully portioned, and the prospect of a better future seemed almost non-existent. The closest neighbors, many exhausting miles away, also faced their own hardships, and loneliness was a constant and oppressive companion in the ranch's isolation. A constant reminder of the dryness that not only parched the land beneath their feet, turning streams into cracked beds and pastures, into fields of dry straw, but also withered the hopes of Sarah Miller and her two children, Lily 10 and Tom 12. 2 years had passed since the tragic and sudden death of John, her husband, and their father in a cruel horse accident, and his absence hung over the ranch like a perpetual shadow, a void that no amount of hard work seemed capable of filling. Life, since then, had become a daily and exhaustive battle against the relentless forces of nature and unforgiving circumstances. Sarah, a woman in her early 30s whom life had forced to mature, prematurely showed fine premature wrinkles of worry around her blue eyes. Lily, with her sun-bleached blonde hair but with a sparkle of innocence in her eyes, was a dreamy, spirited girl with a faraway gaze. It was on one of these days of arduous and monotonous routine, while Tom and Sarah were mending a shaky fence at the property line, under the scorching sun that burned their skin and parched their lips, that a distant and unusual sound caught their attention, breaking the heavy silence of the desert. Sarah hesitated for a moment, the dilemma weighing heavily on her mind, the pros and cons battling it out. The arrival of the wounded cowboy, dragged by Tom and Sarah to their small cabin, brought a new and palpable dynamic to the Miller Ranch, an intoxicating mix of hope and a growing apprehension that hung in the air like a mist. He was on the verge of death, his breathing shallow and irregular, each breath a struggle. Tom, young as he was, helped his mother with surprising dedication, overcoming the revulsion of blood and wounds. The little food they had now had to be divided into even smaller portions, and water, already scarce, was rationed even more strictly. A solitary rider, a tall and imposing figure with an ugly, grotesque scar cutting across his face from eye to mouth like a birthmark of evil, and disguise his true intentions under a mask of false cordiality, a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. He knocked on the door and, with an unctuous voice, asked Sarah about the whereabouts of a supposed friend who, he claimed, had gotten lost in the region and seemed to be behaving strangely. Sarah, immediately suspicious, felt the dark and dangerous aura the man exuded, evil hanging over him like the smell of decay. She vehemently denied having seen any stranger, her voice firm and unwavering. But Silas's gaze lingered for a moment, almost imperceptibly, at a window, where he glimpsed Arthur's silhouette in bed, a figure under the blankets. The shock on Silas's face was quick and almost invisible to Sarah, a micro-expression of surprise and perverse satisfaction. But the hatred and satisfaction in the henchman's eyes were palpable, bubbling like a slow poison. He knew, with cold and calculating certainty, that Arthur was there, hidden under the care of that family. Stopped in the distance and observed the ranch with binoculars, his dark eyes sweeping every corner of the property with disturbing intensity. The stranger's visit left Sarah tense, with a strong premonition of imminent danger. She perceived the thin and dangerous thread that connected Mr. Mystery to something dark and, above all, deadly. Arthur's whispers about Silas and the gold began to make frightening sense, pieces of a deadly puzzle fitting together. Helping the cowboy was not just an act of charity. It was a point of no return into a world of obscure secrets and incalculable risks that the Miller family had never imagined in their worst nightmares. The plot deepened, and life on the ranch was about to transform from a struggle for survival into a race against time, with Silas's threat hanging like a black and stormy cloud over their heads, ready to break. The question now was not just whether they could save Arthur, but whether they could save themselves from the storm that was brewing, a storm that would bring with it violence and despair. It was Silas, a cruel and merciless henchman, whose legends of brutality preceded him, whispered with fear through villages and camps. He was known to be the shadow of a powerful and feared local rancher, Elias Vance, a man whose cruelty was as vast as his lands. Silas was searching for Mr. Mystery under direct orders from Vance. The rancher, a man of unbounded greed and a heart of stone, had discovered that the cowboy whose real name was Arthur Morgan, a former partner of his in illegal and dangerous ventures, had fled with a significant portion of gold treasure, the result of a daring heist against the government. Silas was relentless in his missions, and the idea of finding Arthur, and especially the gold, was his sole obsession, the driving force of his existence, the air he breathed. Sarah tried to hunt small, pathetic, and scrawny animals in the arid lands barely enough for one meal, and scavenged the fields for edible herbs and roots, but abundance was a luxury they didn't know, and nature seemed stingier each day, hardening life. Scarcity became a daily and torturous challenge, a constant reminder of their own vulnerability, but they refused to give up on the man they had taken in, feeling that a life was in their hands. Changing the damp claws on the man's feverish forehead and feeding him the thin soup Sarah prepared with the few ingredients they had, each spoonful an act of hope. Lily, meanwhile, sat patiently beside the makeshift bed, made of hay bales and old blankets, reading stories aloud from a worn book, her childish and soft voice trying to calm the man's delusions, hoping her words could draw him away from the nightmares that tormented him. They affectionately called him Mr. Mystery, since he didn't reveal his real name, a nickname that perfectly translated the aura of enigma that surrounded him. The stranger's presence, paradoxically, brought a sense of purpose to the family, uniting them around a common goal, saving him, as if his life depended on their own breaths, a new reason to fight against adversity. Sarah, with her meager and precarious first aid experience born of a rural life where self-sufficiency was law, gathered what she could. Clean cloths, water heated in an old pot over the wood stove, and some herbal ointments that John, her husband, used for the animals. She did what she could to stop the abundant bleeding that poured from the man's wounds and to clean them, with a dedication that bordered on blind faith in life. It wasn't long before she discovered the exact extent of his injuries, a severe fracture in his leg, swollen and deformed at an unnatural angle, and a deep gash on his head, likely the result of the violent fall from the horse, leaving him in a state of near unconsciousness, floating between life and death. His belongings were minimal, almost insignificant for a man in such fine and quality clothing, contrasting with the poverty of the ranch. An old, worn leather wallet, containing only a few crumpled and dusty banknotes and a small silver locket, with an intricate and almost illegible design, which Sarah carefully put away, feeling a mysterious weight and growing curiosity in her hands. The man was delirious with a high fever for days and nights on end, his voice hoarse and guttural, murmuring disconnected names and fragmented phrases that seemed to come from a nightmare. Silas ... He'll get me ... Each word was a piece of a dark puzzle. Tom and Lily, despite the initial fear they felt in the presence of such a debilitated and mysterious stranger, who seemed to carry the scent of danger, ended up growing fond of the outsider with surprising innocence. As Mr. Mystery slowly recovered, with small but constant steps, a little more strength returning to his body each day, the Miller Ranch began to feel the impact of the additional expense his recovery generated. It was on one of those days, as life followed its arduous routine, that the precarious peace of the ranch was abruptly shattered, like a mirror falling and splintering. Silas, noticing the ranch's precarious state, the evident poverty in every detail, decided to approach Silas, bid farewell with a veiled threat, a sinister promise of return that sent chills down Sarah's spine, leaving a cold feeling in her stomach. Silas's visit left an indelible mark of panic and apprehension on the Miller ranch. With every shadow cast by the setting sun upon the parched land, Sarah felt the imminence of a violent return, a chilling sensation that ran down her spine. A notorious cowboy, whose exploits in bank and train robberies were whispered in camps and towns, a name that evoked both fear and respect, who pursued him relentlessly for miles across the arid land. Lily recoiled, terrified by the idea of dangerous outlaws and the existence of a gold treasure, a concept so distant from her reality of destitution, a nightmare becoming real, and oblivious to the imminent danger that hung over them like a raven on the roof. The morality of the situation tormented her, questions echoing in her mind like a painful echo. John, her late husband, had always taught her the unwavering importance of honesty and loyalty, principles she cherished above all else, which were the pillar of her life. But what if that loyalty cost her children's lives? The anguish was palpable, a tight knot in her chest that made it hard to breathe, a pain deeper than any physical wound. Tom, despite the latent fear he felt a pang of fascination for the adventure. A difficult, courageous decision, but one that emanated from her deepest conviction, from the essence of who she was. She approached Arthur's bed, who looked at her expectantly, his face pale and full of gratitude. "We will protect you, Arthur. We won't hand you over to Silas, but you need to help us protect ourselves too, to fight for our lives, for now they are intertwined." Arthur, deeply moved by that woman's courage in the midst of his own misfortune, a gesture of humanity he hadn't seen in a long time, nodded, his eyes welling up with gratitude. From that moment on, they became accomplices, united by a cause that went far beyond individual survival, an alliance forged in despair and hope. The turnaround was complete. The widow and her children, once passive victims of poverty and fate, were now protagonists in a story of suspense and danger, with the fate of the gold and their own lives at stake. The tension mounted, for they knew that at any moment Silas could return, and next time he wouldn't be alone, but would come with the full force of Elias Vance, ready for a final confrontation. The thrill of danger and the promise of a world he only knew from books, now unfolding before his eyes. Sarah, however, felt the overwhelming weight of responsibility fall upon her shoulders, a burden too heavy to carry alone. She had two choices, both terrible and fraught with consequences: surrender Arthur to Silas and perhaps guarantee her family's safety, freeing themselves from imminent danger and a life of misery, or protect him and, in doing so, plunge headfirst into a dangerous conflict, a war that wasn't hers, but had found her. The extreme poverty they lived in weighed on her mind. The temptation to escape that misery was strong, an easy way out. But the idea of betraying a man who had trusted them, who had placed his life in their hands, was simply unbearable for her conscience, a price she was unwilling to pay. Arthur had managed to evade his pursuers for some time, a remarkable feat for a wounded man, but the fall from his horse and the severity of his injuries left him vulnerable at the mercy of luck and the compassion of strangers. "I'm a marked man, Sarah," he said, with a tone of regret and a weight in his voice that conveyed years of a fugitive life filled with remorse. "Elias Vance won't stop until he finds me and takes what he believes is his. And now, he knows I'm here. You are in danger because of me, and I am truly sorry for that. I understand if you want to turn me in." But he was also a man with a crooked sense of justice, a moral compass that guided him through dangerous paths, yet set him apart from other outlaws. He was, in fact, a former partner of Elias Vance, a tyrannical and unscrupulous rancher who controlled much of the region not by law, but by brutal violence and intimidation, sowing fear wherever he went, a true monster. Arthur recounted the dark and intricate story. He and Vance, along with other accomplices, had planned and executed a large and daring gold heist from a government train, a treasure that would make anyone's fortune, every outlaw's dream. However, Vance, and his insatiable greed and treacherous nature revealed his true colors. He betrayed all his partners, killing them one by one, coldly and calculatingly, to claim each share of the stolen gold. Arthur, perceiving the deadly trap closing around him, managed to escape by a hair's breadth with a small, but significant, portion of the gold before Vance could catch him and silence him forever. The gold, the reason for all the danger, was hidden in a place only he, Arthur, knew, a secret buried deep in his memory. She knew, with a glacial certainty that cut to the soul, that the precarious peace, however fragile, had reached its definitive end. As soon as Arthur regained a little more consciousness and, more importantly, lucidity, his eyes regaining focus, Sarah confronted him directly, without beating around the bush. Her voice choked with worry and her face etched with anguish. She asked him straight out about the man who had visited them, the dark figure who terrorized their ranch, and why he was being so relentlessly pursued, seemingly worth his life and those of her children. Arthur, still weak and debilitated, his body reacting to the pain, perceived the gravity of the situation into which he had unwittingly drawn this courageous and kind family. He saw the honesty and vulnerability in Sarah's gaze, the genuine concern she expressed, and knew that he owed them the complete truth, no matter how dangerous it might be for his own safety. With a hoarse voice and heavy breathing, the story emerging in whispers, Arthur revealed his true identity. Arthur Morgan. Arthur's fractured leg and head wound were caused by a treacherous ambush set by Silas, Vance's loyal and merciless henchman. The revelation of the truth was a shock to Sarah and the children, an avalanche of information that completely changed their perception of the stranger they had welcomed into their humble home. The following night was sleepless for Sarah. She watched her children sleeping soundly, so innocent. At dawn, with the first rays of sun painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Sarah made a decision. Sarah's courageous decision to protect Arthur, an act of solidarity that defied logic in her situation, brought a thick layer of tension and constant vigilance to the Miller Ranch. Days turned into agonizing waiting, each dawn seemingly announcing Silas's inevitable return, the shadow that refused to leave. His memory, blurred by the blow to his head, was like a puzzle with missing pieces, and each memory was an effort. Arthur, with Sarah's tireless help, who searched every corner of the cabin, rummaged through his few and worn possessions, the battered leather wallet, the silver locket Sarah had carefully put away, and a small wooden chest he carried with him on his travels. It was a subtle sensation, an imbalance in its weight. As she squeezed it, as if searching for a hidden secret, a small, almost imperceptible hinge yielded, revealing a tiny, almost invisible secret compartment. The path was treacherous, and Silas and his men could be lurking around any bend in the road, in any rock shadow. With every whisper of wind that passed through the cabin window, Sarah felt the proximity of danger, a sensation that chilled her soul and made her nerves jump. She looked at her children, Tom and Lily, and felt the overwhelming responsibility weighing on her shoulders, a burden that grew heavier by the moment. They had become involved in something far bigger than they could have imagined, a conspiracy that could cost them their lives, a struggle that would drag them into an abyss. The motivation was clear: to ensure their children's safety, and perhaps to find a way out of the overwhelming poverty that afflicted them, a glimmer of hope amidst the darkness that seemed to engulf them. Survival mingled with the hope of a better future, a future that seemed increasingly distant, but uncertainty hung in the air like a storm cloud. The race against time had begun, and the fate of the Miller family and Arthur's gold were about to collide in a climax that would change everything forever, for better or worse. Inside, folded and almost indistinguishable from time and use, was an old, yellowed, and brittle piece of parchment. It was the map. Sarah's heart pounded, a mix of overwhelming relief and new dread swirling in her chest. The map was rustic, hand-drawn, with enigmatic marks and symbols that looked like ancient hieroglyphs, a code to the treasure. Arthur, seeing it, confirmed with a weak nod that it was the correct map. The treasure that could change their lives, now finally within reach. But the exact location of the treasure was still a mystery to him, for Vance had added another enigma to it, a final layer of protection, a riddle within a puzzle. But the map was not in any of these places. It seemed to have vanished into thin air. With each passing day, the pressure mounted. The feeling that time was running out was suffocating. News of Silas and his men spread like a deadly virus through the few neighboring farms, spreading fear and devastation wherever they went. He had burned a barn a few miles away, in a brutal and cruel act of intimidation, and the message was clear and terrifying. He would not give up until he found Arthur and the gold, and he would destroy everything in his path. He knew Vance had altered the original maps to throw off anyone trying to find it, adding traps and enigmas, but he remembered a crucial reference point, a name that echoed in his mind like a whisper, an old abandoned mine, known in local legends as the Devil's Whisper, located in a remote and difficult-to-access canyon, a place of ill repute. The gold was closer than ever, but so were the dangers associated with it, like a shadow lengthening and seeming to pursue them. Arthur explained that the map contained a riddle for the exact location, a complex conundrum that Vance had created so that only he and Arthur, with their intimate knowledge of the region's ancient places and myths, could decipher it. The tension was palpable, cutting the air with a sharp knife. They needed to decipher the map quickly, before Silas arrived, for they knew he would come, and he would come with relentless vengeance, without hesitation. However, the map with the exact location of the treasure, the key to everything, was hidden in a safe place, but he couldn't remember where he had stored it, his memory as slippery as sand through his fingers. The anguish of not remembering was almost as great as the physical pain. Arthur, still recovering from the severity of his injuries, but with surprising willpower, driven by gratitude and the desire to protect the family who had sheltered him, began instructing Tom on basic but crucial defense tactics, how to observe the surroundings, identify potential threats miles away on the arid horizon, and the blind spots that could be exploited for ambushes. Lily, though startled and wide-eyed at times, especially when Arthur spoke of danger, found a new use for her drawings. Her childish imagination, once focused on flowers and horses, now mapped the ranch's strategic observation points and potential hiding places, transforming fear into a form of resilience and planning, a child becoming a strategist. The family, once fragmented by pain and poverty, was now more cohesive than ever, forged by adversity and united by a common purpose: survival against an imminent threat. Arthur, amidst episodes of excruciating pain and fever that made him delirious again, murmuring of unfamiliar places and names, began to recall fragmented details about the location where the gold was hidden. The search for the map became the family's new and urgent priority. One day, while Sarah was cleaning Arthur's few belongings, a routine she had repeated several times, almost instinctively, she noticed something different about the silver locket she had put away. The discovery of the map brought a momentary sense of relief and renewed dread. The journey to the Devil's Whisper mine would be perilous, fraught with traps and unknown risks. The deciphering of the map, after hours of exhaustive study and Arthur's painful memory, which relived the dark moments with Elias Vance, revealed that the mine the Devil's Whisper was not just a location, but a complex web of ancient tunnels and caves, an underground labyrinth that guarded a centuries-old secret. The gold, the source of all the danger and greed, was hidden in a secret chamber within this subterranean network. And his face pale from exhaustion and blood loss, Sarah made the difficult and courageous decision to go with Tom. She couldn't risk Arthur's life again, and Tom's cleverness would be an advantage. They passed through narrow, dark passages where the lamp's light barely reached, creating dancing shadows and frightening illusions every corner seeming to hide a danger. Finally, after minutes that felt like hours, they reached a larger chamber, where a natural fissure in the ceiling allowed a nearly magical beam of sunlight to penetrate, bending and illuminating a specific section of the rocky wall. It was the light that bends, the first part of the enigma deciphered. He saw the hole, and understanding dawned on him. "Stop! What do you think you're doing?" he roared, drawing his gun with a quick and dangerous movement, pointing it at Sarah. Sarah, acting purely on maternal instinct and desperation, without thinking of the consequences, shoved Tom into the hole, shielding him with her own body as Silas fired. The bullet ricocheted off the rock with a frightening hum, and Sarah felt a sharp burning sensation in her arm, a painful cut that made her stumble. She fell, but managed to climb into the hole immediately after, protecting Tom with her own body, falling on top of him. But the gold was not there, only cold rock and the sound of the wind. By the faint flickering light of the lamp, their eyes widened in shock and disbelief. Before them were stacked wooden crates, old and dusty, but which, when opened, revealed a gleaming, intense golden light, filled with gold. Coins, bars, and jewels shimmered in the flickering light. The wealth was unimaginable, a treasure of legends, the dream of a lifetime materializing before them. But there was no time for celebration or admiration. Silas and his men were trying to climb into the hole, their shouts and the sound of falling rocks growing closer, the sound of their efforts to reach the treasure. The atmosphere was intense, filled with adrenaline and mortal danger. The fate of Sarah, Tom, and the gold were now in the hands of chance and their own audacity. The climax had arrived, and the fight for survival was about to reach its peak in a confrontation that would decide their lives forever. Lily, being small and vulnerable, stayed at the ranch with clear and frightening instructions to hide if Silas appeared. It was the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps and hoarse voices drawing closer, their hungry eyes scanning every corner. Tom, who had been meticulously paying attention to the map's details, and Arthur's whispers, noticed something strange. There was a hidden symbol behind the rock where the light bends, a small mark etched into the stone, almost invisible to the naked eye, but which seemed like a starting point for something greater. He discreetly pointed it out to Sarah, his eyes wide with discovery and a glimmer of hope. Sarah, with a flash of shrewdness born of desperation, realized that the gold's riddle wasn't the light or the lament itself, but something hidden by the light, an illusion, a hidden passage. It was a secret compartment, a passage to the true treasure chamber. With a superhuman effort, she pushed the rock, which moved with a groan, revealing a dark and deep hole, an opening to the unknown, to salvation or perdition. Silas and his henchmen had followed them. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drum echoing in her ears, mixing with the sounds of the mine. She pulled Tom behind a large rock, whispering for him to remain absolutely silent, holding her breath, trying to become invisible. Silas and his men entered the chamber, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the torches they carried, their eyes sweeping the place with insatiable greed. They seemed to know about the gold. The treasure's location was no longer a secret, and the cruel smile on Silas's face confirmed the worst. "Looks like the rats found their way to what's mine," he growled, his voice raspy and full of hatred and triumph. And the solemn promise that they would return an oath made with tears in their eyes and a tight embrace that seemed to say goodbye. The departure was fraught with emotion and tangible fear, the farewell hanging in the air like an omen. Sarah and Tom took minimal supplies, just the essentials for the journey. John's old, rusty but still reliable shotgun, some candles and matches, and the map, now worn from being handled and studied so much. The journey to the canyon was arduous, every step a challenge. The scorching sun, which seemed to suck the very life out of the earth, the arid and desolate landscape, and the constant fear of being followed with every shadow seeming to hide an enemy were there silent and oppressive, companions making the trip even longer. The enigma on the map spoke of the light that bends and the lament of the earth, enigmatic clues that Arthur knew referred to a specific point where sunlight, at a certain time of day, projected in a peculiar way, creating a play of shadows, and where the wind created a howling, eerie sound in the rocks, almost like a ghostly wail of lost souls. With Arthur still too weak to travel long distances, his leg bandaged arriving at the canyon, the entrance to the Devil's Whisper mine was a dark and menacing, a scar on the face of the rocks, seeming to swallow the light. The sound of the wind howling at the entrance was indeed a lament, a sound that sent shivers down Tom's spine, a dark premonition of something ancient and dangerous. Armed only with a kerosene lamp, whose flickering light barely penetrated the abyssal darkness, mother and son entered the oppressive labyrinth of tunnels. With each hesitant step, the suspense mounted. The air was heavy and damp, and the sound of their own footsteps echoed in the depths, amplifying the unsettling silence and the fear that enveloped them. They followed the map's instructions, now imprinted in their minds, and Arthur's fragmented memories, which he had whispered before they left. Suddenly, a noise coming from the tunnel behind them made them freeze, blood chilling in their veins. While Silas and his men were distracted, blinded by greed, as they frantically searched for the gold in the chamber, Silas, alerted by the sound of the moving rock, spun around abruptly, his eyes filled with fury and suspicion. They landed in a smaller, dusty chamber, the smell of mold and earth hanging in the air, mixed with the scent of sweat and fear. The sound of Silas's footsteps approaching the mine opening echoed in the small treasure chamber, a sound that chilled the blood and intensified the dread. Sarah, despite the throbbing pain in her wounded arm, which pulsed with every heartbeat, knew they had no time to lose. Every second, their lives were in imminent danger. "Tom, we need something to block the entrance. The one near the entrance," she ordered, her voice firm despite her fear and pain. Tom obeyed with surprising agility, and Sarah, with a strength she didn't know she possessed, a strength born of maternal desperation, began to strike the beam with force and determination. With each blow, suffocating dust and small fragments of rock fell from the ceiling, a prelude to what was to come. Sarah stumbled, her wounded arm throbbing with every step, but Tom walked by her side carrying a small leather bag he had grabbed before the collapse filled with gold nuggets. He had managed to collect from the treasure chamber a small but significant treasure. The quantity wasn't immense. It wasn't the fortune Silas had sought, but it was enough. The treasure that would change their lives forever, lifting them from misery. Lily, seeing her mother and brother back, unharmed, ran to embrace them, tears of relief streaming down her face, mixing with dust and sweat. Arthur, weak but with a smile of satisfaction and peace on his face, felt a relief and gratitude he hadn't felt in years, not since his life had become a constant flight. He knew he was forever indebted to them. "Mom, what are you doing?" "It's dangerous." There, Sarah realized an old dream. She opened a small fabric shop, a modest business, but one that flourished and brought her a satisfaction the ranch never could. Tom, with the remaining money, bought fertile land and invested in cattle, becoming a prosperous and respected rancher, building his own empire through honest work. Lily, with her innate talent for drawing, blossomed and became a recognized artist in the region, her canvases capturing the beauty of the desert and human resilience. Arthur, free from Vance's persecution and with Sarah's help, fully recovered, his body and soul healed from the wounds of the past. Finding redemption, he decided not to return to the life of an outlaw. With a small piece of the gold that Sarah convinced him to accept, he bought a small, secluded ranch where he lived a quiet and honest life, far from chaos and violence. He occasionally visited the Miller family, whom he considered his own, a family that had given him a second chance and a home, proving that kindness, however simple, can yield the greatest treasures. And so the ranch that was once a stage of suffering and deprivation became the seed of a full and happy life for the Miller family, now free from the ghost of poverty, and for Arthur, who found redemption in the compassion of strangers. Tom asked, frightened, his face pale and eyes wide. "If that beam falls, the mine will collapse. We'll be trapped. Hurry, we don't have much time," she exclaimed, looking around desperately, her eyes scanning the surroundings for a solution. Sarah replied, sweat running down her face, mixing with dust and tears, an image of unwavering resolve. The noise from outside intensified, and they could hear Silas's shouts of frustration and threats. Growing closer, the man's fury overflowing. Finally, with a deafening crack that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, the beam gave way, breaking into pieces and falling with a crash. The chamber ceiling began to creak and groan, and large stones started to fall, a deadly rain of debris. "Quick, Tom. We have to get out of here. Now!" Sarah screamed, pulling her son with her good arm towards a secondary tunnel, a narrow, dark passage that Arthur had mentioned as a possible escape route, a last resort, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. The boy, his eyes wide with fear, yet with a glimmer of determination he'd inherited from his mother, spotted some loose planks, remnants of old mine supports, and some large, irregular, heavy stones that had fallen from the ceiling. Behind them, the roar of the collapse intensified, a doomsday sound that made their hearts pound. The entire mine seemed to tremble and groan in its foundations, like a dying creature. Moments after crawling out, emerging into a hidden opening on the canyon face, protected by dry bushes and rocks, they heard a final, deafening crash that made the earth vibrate beneath their feet, a tremor that spread for miles. The main entrance to the Devil's Whisper mine completely collapsed, burying Silas and his men under tons of rock and earth, and with them, most of the gold. Sarah and Tom, exhausted and dirty, their bodies aching and trembling with relief, looked back at the giant cloud of dust rising from the canyon, and a mix of overwhelming relief and strange sadness washed over them. The danger had passed, but the cost was high, leaving a scar on their souls. Together, with a superhuman effort, driven by adrenaline and the instinct for survival, they managed to push one of the heavy gold crates and some planks into the hole, creating a makeshift and precarious barrier, but one that they hoped would delay Silas and his men for a few precious minutes, buying them time to think. Outside, Silas's fury was palpable, his shouts of rage and impatience echoing through the tunnels, making the mine walls tremble. He hammered violently on the makeshift barrier, brutally ordering his men to remove the obstacles that stood between him and his greed. Sarah knew the barrier wouldn't last long. It was merely a temporary solution, a matter of time until brute force reached them. While Tom, with his small hands, tried to reinforce the barricade with more stones, Sarah observed the gold, the source of all the danger and suffering, its malevolent shimmer attracting misfortune. A dangerous and desperate idea formed in her mind, inspired by her husband's teachings. She remembered John's lessons about the fragility of old mines, about the crucial importance of support beams to prevent collapses. There was a precarious support beam, visibly corroded by time and infested with termites, in the corner of the chamber, looking like a scar on the mine itself. "Tom, grab the pickaxe we found in the main tunnel. It's our only chance, son. Trust me. There's no other way out." They crawled through the narrow tunnel, the dust suffocating and the smell of damp earth mingling with sweat and fear. They returned to the ranch, the journey back as exhausting as the journey there, each step a victory over danger. With the gold Tom had salvaged, they were able to sell the ranch, the arid lands that had caused them so much suffering, and move to a small, welcoming town nearby.